The Russian collusion hoax has been called the biggest political scandal in American history. My next guest, international security professor Max Abrahams, has called Russiagate a sophisticated political coup attempt to overturn a presidential election that will permanently reduce American public support for its media, government officials and agencies. Now, the wild allegation that Trump had colluded with Russia to all but steal the 2016 election was reported uncritically by the bulk of the media for years. Now that narrative is falling apart, that very dubious, politically motivated narrative. But one can argue that the damage is already done. The operation to discredit the Trump presidency and undermine the democratic process worked. And if you look at some of the polling, a disturbing number of left-leaning voters in America believe that Russian collusion determined the 2016 election result. Many of these Democrat voters to this day believe that Trump stole the election with the help of Russia. I'm now joined by international security professor Max Abrahams. Max, recent events have exposed Russiagate as a hoax, an operation, whatever you want to call it. Can you explain to my viewers what happened?
Sure. I mean, it's a very complicated, situation, the Russiagate across many different years and involving many different players. But a foundational component of it very early on was what's known as the Steele dossier. And the Steele dossier was important because it was early allegations of Trump colluding with the Russians, helping him to beat Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. That information was then used explicitly by U.S. government agencies, including FBI, to authorize warrant, a wiretapping of Trump associates. Also, that information was leaked to the media, BuzzFeed in particular, and it just went viral. That basically set the narrative for years and years of allegations that would again surface in the Mueller report and in the impeachment trials. So Hillary Clinton advocates will say, oh, no, you're making too big of a deal of the Steele dossier, but it really was very influential in terms of getting both the U.S. government as well as the U.S. media to buy into this narrative. And what we've discovered increasingly, including over the past week, is that the Steele dossier was totally nonsense. We knew previously that it was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign. What we didn't fully realize is that the contents of that dossier was based on just completely made up statements by Hillary Clinton's own associates. So she paid for it and then she filled it with rubbish contents.
So you could argue almost if there was any Russian collusion in 2016, it wasn't from the Trump camp. It looks like it was from the Clinton camp to engineer this elaborate story to really undermine a US president.
Yeah, I'll try to concretize this to give one example. An associate of hers named Charles Dolan apparently went to a hotel in Moscow where Trump had allegedly stayed. And allegedly he stayed in some presidential suite because he wanted to stay in the same room that Obama had stayed in. And that may have been factual. But then, based on that sort of tidbit, Dolan elaborated and embellished by creating the infamous P-tape by saying that all sorts of salacious, sexual, embarrassing incidents had taken place there. And so this is an example of how a fact was then twisted in order to implicate Trump. And it was based on actually the relationship between Hillary Clinton, her associates, and Russian officials, rather than any actual nefarious relations between Trump and Putin.
But we knew from almost the very beginning, though, Max, this dossier was suspect. There was things in it that just could not be true and were debunked almost immediately. And yet we had this Russiagate nonsense continue for years. And has there been any accountability for those who were complicit in pushing this Russian collusion fantasy, the government agencies, the academics who pushed it, and of course, most importantly, I would say, the media. The media was so complicit in pushing this narrative. They gave each other awards for covering it. And now that it's fallen apart, has there been some sort of a reckoning?
I don't think that has happened yet. And this, unfortunately, is often the case where there is very little accountability by the establishment. I think back to the 2003 Iraq War, for example, with the claim that, Saddam had all these WMDs. And of course, that turned out not to be true. The elites that pushed that narrative, they were not penalized. They were made, for example, the editor of The Atlantic, or they were promoted within think tanks like Foundation for Defense of Democracy and within the Brookings Institute. So I expect that there won't be a full reckoning, even though all of the lies are really starting to be exposed. That said, I personally cannot even look at Rachel Maddow on MSNBC without sort of chuckling to myself, because for years now she has made a huge deal about Russiagate by specifically sort of ratifying the contents of the Steele dossier. I do suspect that there will be many viewers who view her as a joke after this, and I really hope so, because she's earned it.
Oh, has she ever earned it? She's not alone, but you're right. Some of the absolute hysterical nonsense she's peddled as fact.
She's really just the worst offender. But it's true that this narrative took off like wildfire across all sorts of media. It was, a fixture on CNN, Washington Post, New York Times. Journalists for these, supposedly, reputable publications, they would end up winning, Pulitzer Prizes from promoting this conspiracy theory. So this is a conspiracy theory that had widespread support across mainstream media, including within the government. And I do hope that public opinion will start to change now that it's become incontrovertible that Russiagate has much less to do with Russia than it does with Hillary Clinton, frankly.
Well, you hope so, but we already know only around 11% of Republicans have trust in the mainstream media. The percentage is obviously much higher among Democrats, and a lot of Democrats believe the Russian collusion narrative. They believe the election was stolen, and it really is quite sad, the impact it's had. Just lastly, I know you've said that people would be crazy to support government-involved censorship of media after what we've seen with Russiagate and the Afghanistan papers and, of course, Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. But is it the government-led censorship we need to worry about most? Isn't it the big tech and mainstream media collusion that we saw before the 2020 election with the Biden file story, for example, being buried, a legitimate story being buried? Tell me about the concern about censorship going forward.
Well, there's an irony that over the past 4 years, we've seen more and more hysterical calls for basically regulating what the public can see in the media. And this has been pushed not just by the Biden administration, but also by big tech and major social media platforms themselves, like Twitter. And of course, the irony is that as there's more popularity, especially among Democrats, for preventing misinformation, we're finding that it's those very people who are responsible for most of the misinformation. And so I'm very uncomfortable with restrictions on informational content, particularly given the record of those who purport to be sort of the arbiters of truth.
Well, yeah, we need some fact checkers to fact check the fact checkers, the official fact checkers, because they've become a source of propaganda themselves in some stories. Max Abrahms, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.